Yeah,
Um,
it's fine.
yeah, yeah, this looks fine. So yeah, like I was talking a little bit about me. So I am a staff engineer at VMware. I've been working on the Kubernetes project since the past 4 years, and I'm a member of the Kubernetes steering committee. So the steering committee is like the topmost body in Kubernetes that governs the whole project. And you can also find me on GitHub and Twitter. And just a short disclaimer that like this talk is going to be about like general open source, but also I am mostly familiar with the Kubernetes project. So most of the examples are going to be about Kubernetes. So yeah, like with that out of the way, let's just move to the next slide.
Yeah, sorry.
Great. So let's understand what is open source in the first place. So while there have been many debates about the definition of open source, like if you look at how what the definition of open source is, lots of people have lots of different opinions. So here's what the definition from Wikipedia says. So overall, open source requires that one, open source software be related to source code that is written by one or more authors. So you can have code on GitHub that's written by a single author, or you can have a large community like Kubernetes or Linux. The second part is licensing. That's also pretty important. So the license should be such that it allows people to study, change, or distribute the source code. And finally, the most important thing is that the collaboration should be in a public manner, and that is important to support large and diverse communities. So for all the means and purposes of this talk, we're going to consider projects on a few platforms. If we can move to the next slide. So yeah, so we're gonna consider code that you can find on platforms like GitHub, GitLab, or Bitbucket. Now, some of you may be familiar with open source projects on GitHub, but always see people asking why they should care about these projects and why they should look to contribute to them. Basically, if I'm contributing to an open source project, what do I even get from it?
Hello.
Yes. So can you move to the next slide, please? Thank you. So I'm not gonna sugar. Like, can we, the previous slide. This is the next slide. Can we move to the two previous slides, please? Thank you.
This
So,
one?
so I'm not gonna. Yeah, yeah. So I don't want to sugarcoat any of the reasons. So let's dive right into the numbers.
Sorry.
And let's
Yeah,
be
sorry.
real.
I'm not muted.
Uh, yeah. So like we all care about being employed and making more money at our
That
jobs.
is
And
coming from her side, that Nikita side.
Kanika, can you mute yourself, maybe?
Yeah, sure. Just a minute.
Um, you can move to the previous slide. Yeah, thank you. So talking a little bit about like the open source jobs report, the recently from the Linux Foundation. So the demand for open source engineers is increasing. So I'll cut this short because we are very short on time. So like the demand for open source engineers is increasing. Even like on my team, we are hiring lots of people, and there are lots of other companies who are hiring more people. At the same time, the supply is not enough. So there's like hiring managers. 93% of hiring managers find it difficult to hire open source engineers. And you might have seen like the latest tech news websites. The market is pretty hot right now. So like there's lots of jobs in place, and lots of people want to hire more. So if you build expertise in open source, you know, like really guarantee you that you are going to find a job pretty easily. So moving on to the next slide. While numbers and the previous slide, please. Yeah. So while numbers and money obviously are important, like I continue to show up in the Kubernetes project for the communities. I came for the core, but I stayed for the community. And this picture is from KubeCon in Barcelona a couple of years ago, just I think like a year before the pandemic. And I got to meet and make friends from all around the world, and something that would have absolutely not been possible if not for open source. And when I usually tell people this, they are all pretty excited. Like, hey, you get to pay, like you get paid more money. You like get to travel all around the world. You get to learn more skills. Like that all sounds good. Like sign me up. But then they usually take a pause because like what if this needs a lot of more experience or skills that I don't have. So can we move to the next slide, please? Thank you. So while you don't need to worry about that at all when it comes to open source projects, because you really don't need that much experience. So beginners and students are also welcome in the project, and like lately there've been a very huge increase in student contributors. So you don't need any formal degree or education. You don't need to have expertise in the project. Like when I was talking, like I was just saying a few minutes ago, when I was starting with Kubernetes, I didn't even know how to pronounce it in the first place. And you definitely don't need to pay for certifications or any courses. It's all free. So all you need is an interest to contribute, decide to learn more, and just show up with questions as much as possible. Can we go to the next slide? Thank you. So you can also find internship or mentorship programs, to be clear, that you can that can help you get started. So Outreach is a very popular program that pays $6,000 stipend to mentees to underrepresented groups in tech to work on open source projects. So you get a proper one-on-one mentorship from open source project maintainers. And one thing to note is that this is not only for students, which is a common misconception that people have. Another similar program is the LFX mentorship program from the Linux Foundation. This is again open for all and is not limited to students only. And finally, we have Google Summer of Code, which is a student-oriented program where Google pays students to work on open source projects. I actually got started this way, and I highly recommend to anyone who wants to get involved with this. And while these programs are like excellent mentorship avenues, there's also another reason why I'm calling these out, because if you want to get an idea of which open source projects you should be picking up, take a look at the projects that these programs support. For example, if you move to the next slide, you'll see that you can find lots and lots of them, like including Firefox, Android, Linux, Ubuntu, and Kubernetes. And with so many of these projects, it can also get pretty confusing on how to choose a single project out of all of these. So here's some tips on how you can get started. Can we move to the next slide? Yeah. So first, pick a project that's related to your job, so you can convince your manager to let you work on this during work hours. One suggestion I give people is to go to your manager with a list of reasons why working on this project is important for the business, how it can help make more revenue, because let's be honest, everyone cares about revenue at the end of the day. So come up with a plan where you can start contributing just 4 hours per week. So yes, just 4 hours per week. So most managers are okay with the 4 hour per week approach to start with, and once they see how beneficial this is, you can ask them to increase this duration. And the next one, so the next one is that obviously find a project that's related to what you actually like doing. So it needs to be related to the interest. And the next point that we have is that it needs to be related to a programming language that you're already familiar with. And I'm not going to lie, getting started with open source has its own learning curve. So if you already add an unfamiliar language to the mix, it becomes pretty intimidating. And the next point about documentation is also pretty important. So find projects that have good documentation and will have a smoother learning curve for you. And finally, projects with clearly defined roles. For example, in the Kubernetes project, we have a release team which offers a proper mentorship program, and we have defined roles in each of the release team programs. So look for projects related to your job, related to what you're interested in and what you already know and matches with your current skills, and also projects that offer a smoother onboarding path for you. Okay, now can we move to the next slide? Thank you. So now that you're familiar with how to choose a project, let's find out how you can dive right in and start talking to these project maintainers. So the first step is join the communication channels where the project maintainers interact with each other. So these platforms can be Slack, Discord, or other tools. So introduce yourself and say hi and ask questions. The next step is to join the project's mailing list. So this is where you'll find important information that's broad reaching towards the whole project. So most open source projects use Google Groups, but I think there might be other tools as well. If there are meetings being recorded, Kubernetes posts them on YouTube, I think some other projects do that too. Definitely look through those because they have a wealth of information related to like the historical context and how the project came about and how maintainers talk to each other. Now moving on, remember that it's also okay to lurk around. It's all totally okay to feel intimidated and to start small. So you don't need to start talking or introduce yourself if you're not comfortable. Can we move to the next slide, please? Yeah, so I would honestly recommend to actually start lurking around because it gives you an idea of who is who and what tasks are being worked on, what's on the roadmap. So once you get an idea of this, you can jump right in and actually start contributing more. Great. Now, to talk about contributing, the first thing you need to remember is like you need to set up your development environment, which means you need to prepare your computer in such a way that you can start contributing. So the way to do that is through documentation. So moving on to the next slide. So most projects, like this is an example for Kubernetes, they have like Kubernetes.dev. So they have like proper, like you can find contributor documentation on how you can get started and how you can contribute and design docs and things like that. We can just move on to the next slide. Yeah, so like that's kind of where you can find the documentation. And a little bit about documentation in general, like how should you go about approaching this. So first start with user-facing docs to understand the project and its features better. Next, I would say move on to the contributor-facing docs. So first user-facing to understand the project itself. Next is contributing. So this is what we just talked about, like setting up your development environment. Thirdly, the design docs to understand the history and context for why features were built the way they were. And finally, if you come across anything that you don't understand in these docs, ask questions on Slack and contribute fixes back to these docs yourself. This could be simple things like typos or actually big changes, like maybe like a feature that's not documented already. Maybe we can talk about that. So by the end of this approach, you will actually have contributed to the project. Can we go to the next slide? Yeah, so this is just a screenshot of like documentation that I got started with, just reading about the Kubernetes community and making small changes to this documentation. And then in the next slide, you can see like I asked about, like I introduced myself and I asked about like this is the feature that I'm interested in working on and how we can get started. Okay, so let's move on to the next slide and tackle the biggest question on everyone's mind. Uh, can we go to the next slide? Yeah, so like what is the big how do you find a task to work on? That's the most important thing, right? So let's see how you can do that. So the first thing is scratch an itch. So this is the easiest way to get started. So if you're already using a project and you want to implement a feature, then get right to it. If you found a bug, then fix it. This can be very small things too. So like maybe you're reading the code base and you find that it doesn't make sense, or it can be like it can be simplified. Then you can refactor it and add comments or at least fix typos. Honestly, like I know people have opinions about like typo fixes, but like 1 or 2 PRs that you can once you get started and you're fixing typos, it's totally okay. So moving on, also look for labels. So like you can look. So most projects that use GitHub have these 2 labels on their issues called good first issue or help wanted. These labels signify that an issue is beginner friendly, easier to get started with, and has mentorship available. And most contributors to open source get started using this route. Another way is to participate in roadmap planning directly. So you can look around if you show up in planning sessions and see someone mention cool feature that they're working on. You can reach out to them after the meeting to ask them if you can help with the feature, and this will allow you to meet more people in the project and will allow you to work on impactful parts of the project. Now, this is a screenshot of my first big pull request. So I had like 81 review comments from people. So just to like note this thing, like you might get a lot of feedback when you're starting out from the maintainers, but like don't get disheartened by it. It's a very common part of open source. And just like giving you a heads up that this might come across, it's normal and everyone goes through it. So like don't worry about too much about this. Remember, like not all contributions have to be about code. I know I've talked about that a little bit in the initial part of the presentation, but let's look at some non-code contributions that you can get started with. So first one is to like participate in project meetups. issue triage directly. So this sounds small, but just making sure like all the issues on GitHub have the right kind of labels goes a long way making maintainers' lives easier. The other way you can get started is to write blog posts about a feature. Like lots of new contributors have gotten started by just explaining, like reading documentation and writing blog posts that explain more about a particular feature. Next is community management, so things like running mentorship programs or writing more contributor documentation. And there's a lot of thing that comes into this. You can look into that. And finally, you can look at organizing events. So for Kubernetes, we have a team organizing the Kubernetes Contributor Summit each year. And in a pre-COVID world, all of the Contributor Summit organizers got an additional perk that they travel to these international locations where these summits and conferences would take place, would be completely funded. So it's important to know that you're not just doing this for fun, you also get rewarded for it. Now, the things I've talked about now are very, very important when you're growing up in the contributor ladder. So don't just think about code. You need to keep these non-code things in mind because that's when like you get leadership qualities and you're able to handle the big swaths of new contributors that come in. So all of these non-code contributions were the things that helped me become the technical lead and also like become a steering committee member and move up this contributor ladder. So I even got a chance to talk and give a keynote at KubeCon Barcelona in front of 8,000 people. That would absolutely not have been possible without open source. It was an amazing experience and honestly also very scary at the same time. But I really enjoyed it. So I hope you all also like find an open source project that you like and you can contribute to it and you can actually continue sticking with it. So like consistency is the most important thing. So yeah, finally, thank you so much. I know I've like brushed past a lot of this very, very quickly, but we were a little bit short on time and having some technical issues. Thank you so much, Kanika, for helping with the slides, by the way. And yeah, so thank you so much for listening to this. And I hope to see you around in open source. If you have questions, please drop them in the chat. I think I see some questions. On the Hopin platform. I think it's about audio quality. Okay. Well, if you have any more questions, feel free to like reach out to me on Twitter or GitHub or wherever, and we can probably chat more about open source. Thank you. Yeah, thanks everyone for attending. Yes, you can find me on the Nikhita on Twitter. So feel free to reach out to me on Twitter or even the Kubernetes Slack, or just email me. You can find my email on my website. So feel free to do that. Thanks, everyone. Okay, I do see one question that came up about like, can you please explain about contributor-facing documentation again? Sure. So contributor-facing documentation mainly involves, I would say, three things. So one is information about the community in general. So how is the community structured? Does it have like different groups with like each group pertaining to, like most open source projects have a proper structure with some projects related to, I don't know, the architecture or the API part of it, the other part related to release or testing, something like that. The second part for contributor documentation comes around setting your development environment. So like preparing your computer to actually build the project and run the project itself. And the third part of it comes with design docs. So all of these design docs have more like context and insight into why a feature was written the way it was, and has more historical context to understand and why the feature was written the way it was. And you can also like use that to contribute code for those features. I think like that's kind of the three ways to look at it. But once you start diving into like reading these documentation on GitHub, you'll get a hang of how to read and like go through these documentation. Sometimes it can be pretty long, so like maybe you can just glimpse through a bit and then just pick topics that you're interested in. Good. So I think we're over time, but if anyone has questions, feel free to reach out on Twitter or email or wherever on Kubernetes Slack, like Karupia. Thank you, Karupia, mention. And yeah, thank you, everyone. Bye.